The readings are about water, it looks like. In the first reading, Moses is leading the Israelites in the desert. They've come out of Egypt. God has showed them miracles. God has been feeding them. God has been leading them through the Red Sea, destroying the Egyptian army, pursuing them, giving them freedom. And now they're grumbling because they're thirsty. And there's no water, or at least not enough water. And so they want water. And so Moses be like, what am I supposed to do with these people, right? Help me out, Lord. They're going to kill me. That's pretty much what he said. I'm afraid. So God says, all right, take your staff and just strike the ground, strike this rock, and the water will come out and the people will have water. And so the people wanted water and the Lord gives them water. Why? Because God led them out of Egypt. He led them through the waters. He led them into freedom. He led them to Sinai. When you read Jewish literature, why did God lead them to Sinai? What was God doing at the mountain of Sinai? He gave the 10 Commandments. But in Jewish mystical literature, what is it that God is doing with Israel at Sinai? He marries them. And so he gives them the water. He's taking care of them. He loves them. And he argues with them. And they argue with him, right? But he still gives them what they need, and he still leads them through the desert, through that life. So we come to, well, there's Moses. Okay, so Moses, remember, before this, he met his wife, Zipporah, at a well. Do you remember that? It was kind of that. So Moses comes up, and these women are there watering their flocks. So Moses takes and he waters their flocks for them. He takes and does all the work at the well for them. And then their dad says, aren't you going to invite him? Feed him or something. So they go get him and they bring him over, and Moses stays with them, and Zipporah is given to Moses as his wife. So that happens at a well. Well, then, if you go back to Jacob, remember, Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. So Isaac is Abraham's son, and then Jacob is the grandson. Jacob is the one whose name was changed to Israel. So he is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob. And Jacob, he's looking for a wife, so he goes, where do you find a wife? You're at the well. You go to the well. So Jacob goes to the well, and he sees Rachel, and he decides he wants to marry her. Now, the story makes it a little complicated, but eventually he does marry her. And so before that, Isaac, Abraham's son. Now, Isaac didn't go to the well, but what happened is that Abraham sent one of his servants to go. He says, we're not in our homeland. So he sends his servant to go back to the land where we're from, to go find my son Isaac a wife. And so he sends his servant to go, and he goes to the well. And guess what the clue is? The servant's like, how am I going to know which woman it is? What's the clue? She asks, right? That when he asks for a drink, she gives him one. That's how he knows who the woman is to bring back to be Isaac's wife. So Jesus is in Samaria. The Samaritans were Israelites. So in the history of Israel, you have, under King David, you have all the 12 tribes of Israel united, Israel in the north, Judah in the south eventually. But what happens is that after Solomon, the kingdom breaks apart, and then after a few hundred years, because of wickedness, the enemies come in and they attack Israel, and they take all the Israelites out of their land and they disperse them. And then they bring other peoples from other lands in. In ancient times, if you conquered a people and you want to break their will, you want to separate them from their identity, you pull them off of their land. That's how you do it. Because it wasn't just property you move around on. Your ancestors are buried there. So that's how you know. And so they pull the Israelites off of their land, and they bring in 5 other nations of peoples or parts of them into that land. And then eventually they marry and intermarry, and you end up with the Samaritans. So when the Jews, right, who did not intermarry, when they looked at the Samaritans, they're like, right? You intermarried with the Gentiles. We weren't supposed to do that. So Jews and Samaritans didn't really get along. Jesus goes to a well in Samaria, and it's the middle of the day. Usually women are out at the well in the morning. That's when you go out to get the water. But he's in the middle of the day. He's tired. He's thirsty. And he's at the well, and a Samaritan woman comes up, right? And he looks at the Samaritan woman, and he asks for a drink. Now, St. Augustine says right here, he says, see what's going on? Jesus is looking at this woman. He loves her, and he's thirsting for her faith. And so he says the Samaritan woman is an image of the church. Like she's us, that Samaritan woman. Now you might say, wait a minute, I thought another woman was the image of the church. Who's the other woman? Mary. That's right. That's why she's on all the stained glass windows and all that stuff. That's why you see Mary everywhere, right? Everywhere. Because Mary is an image of the church. Why? Because all of our hope is in Jesus Christ as our Savior. He promises to give us salvation and to bring us to life with God. He promises to make us holy, to give us virtue, to set us free, to make us innocent, to make us pure. And he promises all this for us. And all of our hope is that he will deliver. But God in his goodness, Jesus in his goodness and his love for his mother says, you know what, Mom, I'm going to give all this to you right now. And that way, the church, everything that we hope for, everything that we desire from God, everything that God promises to the church is already given perfectly and fully in Mary. So every gift we want, everything we hope for is in her. So we refer to Mary as our hope, not because our hope is in her, but because she has received from Jesus everything that we hope for from the Lord. And so she is our joy, because we rejoice that what we hope for is assured in her, who also helps us to Jesus. But we don't start out that way, do we? If we hope for that kind of holiness, that's something for later. We're not all there yet. I don't think so, right? If we were saying, if Mary is an image of the church, she's the perfect image of the church. Is she an image of the church today yet? We got a ways to go, don't we? So maybe we're a little bit more like the Samaritan woman. And so maybe Augustine had a point. The Samaritan woman is us. Her life's not all together. She's got some difficulties, but Jesus comes to meet her, and he meets her at a well. And so he's thirsting for her faith, and he loves her, and so he asks her for a drink. And she looks at him and says, I know you're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. You're not even allowed to drink from my bucket. So why are you talking to me? Like, not trying to be rude, but we're not from the same world. We're not from the same level of things. Your people don't like my people, and my people don't like the fact that your people don't like my people, so we don't get along. Why are you talking to me? And Jesus says, because God has a gift for you. God has a gift for you today. Do you want it? It's like, a gift for me? Do you want it? Yeah, I want it. Okay, Jesus says, ask me for a drink. What kind of a question is that? God has a gift for you, so ask me for a drink? This is an interesting conversation where Jesus is kind of bringing her in, bringing down her defenses, bringing down her fact that she's like, we're not even from the same world. You're not on this, I'm not on the same level as you. Why are you talking to me? He says, God has a gift for you, so ask me for a drink. And she said, ask you for a drink? You don't even have a bucket. There's a well there. How are you going to get the water out of the well? And Jesus says, I have running water. I don't need the water in the well. I have running water, and I'll give you that running water. And she says, running water? How are you going to give me running water? How am I going to get that? So I got to go back here so I don't lose my place. she's been bringing her jar to the well all the time. She goes out and brings her jar in the afternoon. Maybe she brings it in the morning too. But anyway, this jar of hers, she takes and carries that water, and she carries it back to her home, and she takes that jar and she empties it into the pots and for drinking and for whatever else they need water for in the home. And then she has to go back again at noon, and then she probably has to go back in the evening, and then she has to go back the next day. And she's like, doggone it, this jar, I keep bringing water back because that's what I'm supposed to do, and it doesn't stay in the jar. The jar keeps going empty. This thing isn't working. I mean, it's not like it leaks, it won't hold the water. And this woman is supposed to bring water back to the house. Matter of fact, that's one of the things she does for her family. So Jesus asks about her family. He says, since we're talking, why don't you go get your husband? And she says, I don't have a husband. No, he says, that's right, you've had 5 husbands. Now that refers, according to St. Thomas, to the 5 nations that were brought in by the enemies and intermarried then with the Samaritans. But it doesn't mean that this woman didn't have 5 husbands. Because very often God speaks about something that is large and overarching, a symbol of what's really happening in the whole church, and then he puts that into the life of one person. So in this case, he meets the woman at the well. She's had 5 husbands, and he's like, this isn't really working out for you, is it? This jar, these husbands, this life you're trying to live. And for her, undoubtedly, it's a burden. She's trying to get through it, but it's a burden. And so he offers her different water, a different life. When Jesus talks to us, sometimes we might feel like, well, Jesus, that's easy for you to say, but look at my life, right? I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time, or you know what I did in the past, and you and I aren't on the same level, Jesus. Why are you talking to me, right? Or we could say, my life is a mess, it would be nice if you could help me to rearrange this or that or the other thing. But we don't hope for much. But Jesus wants to have a different conversation. He says, I want to give you living water. I want to give you running water. And so he says to her, I want to give you running water. Do you want it? Yes, she says, I want that running water. And so she brings her jar. And Jesus tells her, that jar is not going to work. That jar is not working out for you now. And that jar isn't going to work for the water that I'm ready to give. So she looks puzzled. It's the only jar she has, right? That's one she's trying to use. Well, where am I going to get another jar? Are you going to give me a jar? Is that the gift? And Jesus says, no, you're the jar. You're the jar that I'm going to give living water to. It's you that will contain this new water that I have to give. Now, he's asking her to change everything. He's asking her he's revealing to her that he knows her life. And he's asking her to trust him, to talk to him, to set down her jar and to take this water. As a matter of fact, when Jesus speaks to her like this at the well, he basically says this, I want to give you living water, and you're the jar. Will you trust me for it? In other words, marry me. Marry me. He doesn't actually say that to her, but that's what the story is about. Jesus is asking her, this is what John is saying. I love John because he never says one thing at a time. That's why the well, that's why the water, that's why the 5 husbands, right? Marry me, he says. The relationship that Jesus wants with us is not one of, I'm here to help, I'm here to make things better, right? Often he does help and often he makes things better, but that's not why he's meeting her at the well. When she finally hears this offer, that what he wants is her, she goes back to her people, the Samaritans. Why? Because they're disenfranchised. They've been separated. Remember, Jesus says, you worship what you don't understand, right? It's not like the Jews comprehended God. That's not it. You worship what you don't understand. You're worshiping, but you're confused. It's not getting you anywhere. We worship, Jesus says, what we understand. We worship the God of Israel. We're worshiping according to the way God wants. Will you join me in what God wants? Will you marry me? And so she'll run off to tell the Samaritans in her village, we're going to be family. God is bringing us back in. But the way that they become family, the way that God brings them back in, is not because God does something miraculous, not because Jesus is doing something to impress her, not because Jesus is there to fix everything. A lot of times we want God to do that for us. And then we look at God or we look at the church and we want our life to be better. We want the church to be better. Why is the church this way? We'll compare the church to somebody else or some other thing. We compare the church to, working on Sundays and getting rich, right? We compare the church to what we could have if we could do things our way without having to follow those burdensome commandments of God all the time. What if we could just do things our way? Couldn't we have what we want? Couldn't we make this jar work for us? If we could just make this jar work, we could get all the water we want. And that's what Jesus tells her. How's that jar working out for you? It's not working out. So he says, you be the new jar. Marry me. She goes back to tell her family, and John gives us an interesting little line. It says that when she went back to tell the village, she left her jar. What does that mean? It means she said yes. The relationship that Jesus wants with you and me is this, a commitment. He says, I'll give myself to you. Take a risk on me. Bet everything on me. Don't try to make what you have work better. Don't try to have me fix it. Just set it down and marry me. And I'll marry you. And what is this? That's what God did with Israel at Sinai. He married them. And he says, we're going to argue, right? We're not going to be of the same mind all the time, but you're stuck with me, and I'm sticking with you. And that's going to work because all that I have to give, now you're the jar. And all that you have to give, I'll be that jar for you. But here Jesus is saying, this is God. God is pouring his life into us. God is giving us water. And he says, you be the jar and you marry me.